Right, okay. Welcome. What we're going to do today is look at another one of the tenses. We started to look at the tenses before. So we looked at the imperfect tense and we've already looked at the present tense. And we're going to have a look at something that's called the aorist tense today. So we'll do the usual thing. We'll just check the English grammar. So it's very similar to actually the grammar we looked at previously, just to kind of make sure we understand where the English sort of fits in. And then we're going to look at how we form this aorist tense in Greek. And we'll look at the two types of verbs that we have currently, which is the omega verbs and the epsilon omega verbs. Okay, and just see how the endings of those differ. We'll do them so one at a time. So that's the plan. We'll kind of start by looking first of all then at the English grammar, just to remind ourselves what we have. So we've got the main tenses that we refer to are the present, the future and the past. Okay. There are others that we use as well, other tenses and some other more complex things to go around the tenses. But essentially, if we can think of the present, so I am teaching Greek or I teach Greek, and we talked about this idea of there being a process in some verbs and the way we use them, or some undefined kind of action. So you can have the I am teaching Greek is a continuous or a repeated action. And we talk about that in the present as we have. But we could also say I teach Greek, which is again in the present, but it's undefined. It's not telling me how much I'm doing it, whether it's repeated or anything about it. It's just giving some undefined action. In the future, I will teach Greek. And again, that comes under undefined action. And then in the past, we have what was going on before. So we have I was teaching Greek. Again, you can think of that in terms of continuous or repeated action, or an undefined way of describing something that's happened in the past. We say I taught Greek. It doesn't say how often I did it. It doesn't say if I only did it once or if I did it lots of times. It's just specifying that something happened in the past relative to when we're speaking. So this is how we sort of think in terms of our English language. And when we come to transferring it to Greek, then we have our present tense is their present tense. Okay. And what we found with the Greek is that it doesn't distinguish between whether it's I am teaching or I teach in terms of the present. And so when you're translating, you can translate either. The context might define one or the other. But in terms of how we have Greek, how the Greek is represented, it's got both parts of that present. In the future, it's the same as the future in English. It's an undefined. I will teach. It's English equivalent. And then we have the Greek tense, the imperfect tense, which is what we looked at before. And so that was where we would translate it with this past continuous or repeated action. So I was teaching. And it gives that sort of continuous sort of nature. So in Greek, however, there is another tense, which is the aorist tense. And this is the undefined tense, or in fact, a default tense. If you wanted to just describe something in the past in Greek, then you would use the aorist tense. It's not a special tense in any particular way. It's as we might say, the default one. So it can mean a one-time thing. Something happened at once in one time, but it also could just mean that things have happened and they may have happened over a period of time or whatever. Okay, so we're going to look at the tense today, and the Greek have a way of distinguishing between the imperfect and the aorist, or rather the continuous and undefined nature of the past, by using the two tenses, the imperfect and the aorist. So we looked at the imperfect. We've got some endings that went with those, and we'll find that the endings for the aorist have some similarities, and then obviously there will be some differences. So that's what we're going to look at more specifically now. And you might remember, and hopefully you do, but in order to distinguish a tense in the past, then there is an epsilon that's added to the front of the verb. Okay, and that's going to take place for the aorist as well. So if we look at how we might define the endings for our verbs. So just before we go through one, it's kind of worth noting that not all verbs are going to follow the rules that go below. So we will come to those later, but most of the rules, most of the verbs follow this rule here, and this is known as the first aorist verbs. Okay, and it's just they're defined by the way that you by their stems. Okay, and I won't go into any more detail than that because all the verbs we'll look at now, they have a stem and their endings work in the same way. So what we're going to do is we're going to write down how we would write luo. That's the verb to untie or to release. And we want the past, so I want I untied rather than I am untying. So I untied, this undefined action. So the first thing is there's a prefix to indicate that the verb is going to be in the past tense. So we're going to put an epsilon at the start of it, and actually we're going to have an epsilon at the front of all of them, as the fact that they're all going to be in the aorist tense. All right. So that's quite a good thing to know. It's exactly the same as the imperfect. The imperfect and the aorist both going to be identified really by the fact that there is an epsilon or some other contraction, which we have talked about, and they're the same in the aorist as well. Okay, so where necessary, the epsilon sometimes merges with another letter, a vowel. But let's not confuse ourselves with that for the moment. So I untied. We then have the stem. So the stem is going to be exactly the same as it is in the other tenses as well. So we note that there is a stem, which is this sort of main distinguishing part of our verb, to give it its definition. So we've got lu, which is going to go in all of our stems. All right. And then, as we've discovered with both the present tense and with the imperfect tense, there is an ending. Now, the ending for the aorist includes a sigma. Okay, and so we have a sigma which is added in. Now we probably could add it into the stem here because it doesn't actually change. It's always the same. So in order to put it into an aorist verb, we end up adding a little sigma into the word, and this is going to help you distinguish between in part between an aorist verb quite quickly and an imperfect, because there's this little sigma that suddenly appears towards the end in lots of cases. And then there's an ending. Okay, and the ending in the case is going to be just one that we have to learn. Right, so it ends with an alpha for I untied. Okay, so we'll go through them now one at a time. So we have a lusa, okay, which is I untied, and then the ending for the second person singular is as. Okay, so lusas. And you'll notice that that actually is similar to the second person singular in the imperfect, except that rather than using alpha, they're using epsilon. Okay, so there's an epsilon sigma at the end, but here in the aorist we have an alpha sigma. Okay, slightly different for the third person singular because we break from the alpha part and there is an n. The new might not be there, so that's sometimes put in a bracket, but we'll leave it in for now. So we'll have a loose end. So that's the peculiar one, if you like. There's the N there rather than, and you'll see why we haven't got an and there when we get a bit further down. We untied. So the first person plural is Amen. Exactly as you finish a prayer, Amen. Okay, so elusamen, and that's a fairly common ending for our first person plural. So in the present, of course, it's omen, and in the imperfect, it's omen, but we have an amen because of the alpha. And then in the second person plural, we have was that eight? So elusate or elusate. Um, in the second person plural, in the imperfect, you have the epsilon tau epsilon, and here you just have the alpha tau epsilon. So again, the distinguishing part is that sigma and then the alpha that appears. And then the third person plural is actually where you get your and picture frozen, which not helped.